the logic of rebirth. And we know that the idea of rebirth or reincarnation, the idea that we have an immense past comprised of a great many lifetimes, and that following the death of our body, that we will have many, many more to come. It's a very ancient idea, and it's a fundamental concept in the theosophical philosophy. And it is ingrained in many Eastern philosophies and is widespread throughout many religions and teachings throughout history. Now here, for instance, is what HPB says about the ancient Egyptian emblem of the winged globe. She says, this is the symbol of hope and the promise of a second birth for the osirified dead. His soul, after due purification in the Amenti, will gestate in this egg of immortality, to be reborn from it into a new life on earth. For this egg in the esoteric doctrine is the Devachan, the abode of bliss, the winged scarabus being alike a symbol of it. The winged globe is but another form of the egg and has the same significance as the scarabus, the koporu, from the root kopru, to become, to be reborn, which relates to the rebirth of man as well as to his spiritual regeneration. And we can see the serpents in that emblem, which HPB says are symbolic of eternity and infinitude and regeneration and rejuvenation, as well as wisdom. Here's from the ancient Upanishads, as they said of old, man verily is formed of desire. As his desire is, so is his will. As his will is, so he works, and whatever work he does, in the likeness of it, he grows. Through his past works, he shall return once more to birth, entering whatever form his heart is set on. When he has received full measure of reward in paradise for the works he did, from that world he returns again to this, the world of works. And I'll bring up this familiar passage from the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna declares to Arjuna, I myself never was not, nor thou, nor all the princes of the earth, nor shall we ever hereafter cease to be. As the Lord of this mortal frame experiences therein infancy, youth, and old age, so in future incarnations will it meet the same. As a man throweth away old garments and putteth on new, even so the dweller in the body, having quitted its old mortal frames, entereth into others which are new. I was kind of surprised to find, kind of stumbled upon this Pew study from a couple of years ago. It showed approximately 1/3 of the people in this country, including Christians, have some kind of belief in reincarnation. I don't know what form that belief might be, but it included all denominations and agnostics, although not many atheists. And so, no doubt the nature of such beliefs are very widely. I'm sure many have a kind of a sentimental or personal view, kind of wishfully seeing it as some kind of extension of their present life or personality, while others might take a more philosophical or impersonal view. But that it has such as wide an acceptance as it apparently does, one could say, is because the idea is so appealing and consistent with our sense of having a continuous identity. We find ourselves unable to think ourselves out of existence. As hard as we might try, it is still me trying to imagine trying to imagine that I am complete nothingness. There's always some sort of spectator there. And for many who do have some kind of a belief in a soul, rebirth into a new body is a more attractive and reasonable prospect than spending an eternity in paradise. After all, we tend to always want to be doing something. This cartoon I rather like, but I think it kind of shows how it's kind of human nature to want to be engaged, to want to be doing something, engaged in a project, working on something, and not just sitting in a state of bliss. And while we're looking at cartoons, I ran across this one, which I thought was pretty good too, where the little boy says, well, I didn't believe in, talking to his grandfather, says, I didn't believe in reincarnation when I was your age either. For a great many with a scientific background and orientation, the whole idea of a soul, let alone reincarnation, is kind of a superstitious relic, or rather a silly belief based on wishful thinking and blind religious faith. And in much of the scientific arena, and there are exceptions, of course, but in much of the scientific arena, the idea of a soul that continues on after the body dies is relegated to the realm of religion and superstition and considered outside the purview of scientific investigation. And we find that when we bring up the subject of reincarnation, the idea is often rejected for these reasons. It is nonsense. Materialists say, because after all, we're nothing but meat machines. Or it is inconsistent with an accepted Christian belief, or it is just wishful thinking. It cannot be empirically proved, and we cannot remember our past lives, and we cannot really know for certain. So why even bother thinking about it? But for those for whom some idea of rebirth or reincarnation has some appeal, how can they move from holding the idea as a vaguely plausible and appealing concept, a wishful thought or a curious belief that may or may not be true? How do they move from that to that of a deeply held conviction, so that it becomes a central principle in one's life, a foundation for thinking and acting? And in her article, What is Truth?, HPB points out that for us humans living in the finite manifested world, there is no room for absolute truth, and we could say for absolute knowledge upon any subject whatsoever. But that there are relative truths, and we have to make the best we can of them. But still, she says, each of us can relatively reach the sun of truth, even on this earth, and assimilate its warmest and most direct rays. To achieve this, there are two methods. On the physical plane, we may use our mental polariscope, and analyzing the properties of each ray, choose the purest. On the plane of spirituality, to reach the sun of truth, we must work in dead earnest for the development of our higher nature. We know that by paralyzing gradually within ourselves the appetites of the lower personality and thereby deadening the voice of the purely physiological mind, that mind which depends upon and is inseparable from its medium or vehicle, the organic brain, the animal man in us may make room for the spiritual, and once aroused from its latent state, the highest spiritual senses and perceptions grow in us in proportion and develop pari passu with the divine man. The metaphor of using the mental polariscope to analyze the properties of each ray, that seems to refer to the dialectic, to the use of logic, of inner dialogue, of reasoning, in examining our ideas and assumptions. We know that logic is an indispensable tool for critical thinking, for evaluating ideas, for examining our principles and assumptions. The rules of logic are quite useful. Anyone who has studied formal logic will knows this well, and especially a study of logical fallacies is very helpful for better recognizing the sometimes foolish and invalid thought processes we might fall into, such as, for instance, the fallacy of conflating correlation with causation, which is a fairly common logical fallacy. However, as we well know, logically derived conclusions are only as good as the premises, the assumptions that we begin with. And if we are led to conclusions that are absurd, that do not agree with what we know to be true, or that are contrary to what we observe in nature, or that conflict with our intuitive sense of what is true, or that conflict with our conscience, we have to go back and re-examine our assumptions. Where do they fall short? What are they leaving out? What are we failing to see? What needs to be refined? So with respect to logic, we must always be be watchful for those ways we may be deceiving ourselves, or such as tailoring our thought processes to support conclusions we are attached to, like justification and confirmation bias and so forth. And we could perhaps think of logic as operating in two general realms, one in the material, objective world in which it is possible to prove something to somebody else by drawing logical conclusions from empirical objective evidence. And this is the logic of the courtroom, or the Sherlock Holmes. And a rational person is forced to accept the conclusion given the evidence or the premises and the rules of logic. But when it comes to concepts and aspects of life that are largely subjective or metaphysical, proof becomes more a matter of kind of an inner awakening to possibilities, of a recognition and acceptance of what resonates within us. It agrees with other ideas that we accept as true. The proof is internal to us, but not something we could necessarily prove to someone else. And so the logic of rebirth then is of this sort, as it necessarily proceeds from one fundamental assumption which cannot be empirically proved to another person. And that is the reality of an immortal self or soul that survives the death of the physical body. Rebirth means the rebirth of something. So for an abject materialist, say, who is convinced that any notion we have of a self that is not is just a product of brain chemistry, and and any notion that we have is a utter illusion. There is no logic of rebirth, as there is no acceptance of the requisite assumption. And William Q. Judge suggests this in The Ocean of Theosophy, where he opens one of the chapters on reincarnation with this statement, which gives a broad view of the logic of rebirth from a theosophical standpoint. He says that unless we deny the immortality of man and the existence of soul, there are no sound arguments against the doctrine of preexistence and rebirth, save such as rest on the dictum of the church, and that each soul is a new creation. This dictum can be supported only by blind dogmatism. For given a soul, we must sooner or later arrive at the theory of rebirth, because even if each soul is new on this earth, it must keep on living somewhere after passing away. And in view of the known order of nature, will have other bodies in other planets or spheres. The soul's immortality, believed in by the mass of humanity, demands embodiment here or elsewhere. And to be embodied means reincarnation. Now, there are two generally recognized forms of logic we use: the deductive, with reasoning from premises to conclusions and from universals to particulars, and the inductive, from which we proceed from observations in nature and derive generalizations or laws. And the scientific method makes use of this type of logic. And we need both approaches because one is kind of a check on the other. For instance, with the scientific method, once a generalization is made or a hypothesis is derived from observations, it must be tested deductively to try to disprove it. Do we find instances where the hypothesis doesn't apply? And if so, then it must be refined or discarded. Now, it seems kind of important to point out that logic in general is a function of the lower mind. That aspect of mind which is closely associated with our life in the manifested world. That aspect of mind which analyzes and compares and evaluates. It is necessary in order for us to function in the world as a rational human being and to make proper choices and live an effective life. We might say that the dialectic, the use of logic and reason in evaluating ideas, represents sort of the higher aspect of the lower mind, or kama manas. Logic can help us sift through ideas and put things in order. It can help steer us in useful directions. However, the logic can only go so far. Towards reaching towards truth. And there are other avenues besides logic and that nourish the inner life. Such would include analogies and correspondences, stories and myths and symbols. Such pathways, we could say, kind of form a bridge between the noetic and the intellectual aspects of mind. For knowledge is ultimately experiential, and we know something when it becomes a part of us, so to speak. HPB says this about analogy: it is the guiding law in nature, the only true Ariadne's thread that can lead us through the inextricable paths of her domain toward her primal and final mysteries. And here I'd like to bring in a quote from Henry Thoreau. This is from his from essay called Walking. And he speaks of knowledge here. He's talking about knowledge in the sense of mundane information. He says, "My desire for knowledge is intermittent, but my desire to bathe my head in atmospheres unknown to my feet is perennial and constant. The highest that we can attain to is not knowledge, but sympathy with intelligence. I do not know that this higher knowledge amounts to anything more definite than a novel and grand surprise on a sudden revelation of the insufficiency of all that we called knowledge before, a discovery that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophy. It is the lighting up of the mist by the sun. Man cannot know in any higher sense than this, any more than he can look serenely and with impunity in the face of the sun." I thought this was a wonderful statement. It speaks of the lighting up of the mist and sympathy with intelligence. These seems like very good ways of trying to understand intuition and how it is kind of comes to us as a light from our higher mind, the noetic side of our being. Well, from a theosophical point of view, we can look to some fundamental broad ideas, metaphysical propositions from which many have found a basis for a logical consideration of the idea of rebirth or reincarnation. And the first would be the reality of the subjective side of life and the idea that there is that aspect of us that is unconditioned and universal. It is a ray from the one, absolute, deific principle, which is beyond all conceptions, indescribable and unknowable. It is the power to perceive and to know, which is greater than any of the vehicles or conditions through which it sees and acts. This higher self reflected through the principle of buddhi, which is the accumulation of all of our past experiences in association with this higher aspect of the mind. We theosophists call the reincarnating ego, the human soul, as distinguished from the personality. It is the permanent individuality. And again, to go back to Thoreau, this is a statement I found in the chapter 5 of Walden, which he kind of speaks to this higher aspect of the human being. I know myself, I only know myself as a human entity, the scene, so to speak, of thoughts and affections. And I'm sensible of a certain doubleness by which I can stand as remote from myself as from another. However intense my experience, I am conscious of the presence and criticism of a part of me, which, as it were, is not a part of me, but spectator, sharing no experience, but taking note of it, and that it is no more I than it is you. When the play, it may be a tragedy, of life is over, the spectator goes his way. It was a kind of fiction, a work of the imagination only, so far as he was concerned. There's a passage in the Secret Doctrine that kind of elaborates on this theme, which we have here. Intimately, or rather indissolubly connected with karma, then, is the law of rebirth, or the reincarnation of the same spiritual individuality in a long, almost interminable series of personalities. The latter are like the various costumes and characters played by the same actor, with each of which the actor identifies himself and is identified by the public for the space of a few hours. The inner or real man who personates these characters knows the whole time that he is Hamlet for the brief space of a few acts, which represent, however, on the plane of human illusion, the whole life of Hamlet. And he knows that he was the night before King Lear, the transformation in his turn of the Othello of a still earlier preceding night. But the outer visible character is supposed to be ignorant of the fact. In actual life, that ignorance is unfortunately but too real. Nevertheless, the permanent individuality is fully aware of the fact, though through the atrophy of the spiritual eye in the physical body, that knowledge is unable to impress itself on the consciousness of the false personality. That leads us to the next fundamental idea, which is the idea of periodicity, that cycles exist throughout great nature, and that all of manifestation is subject to the law of periodicity. This applies to the periodic coming into manifestation of universes, the great breath, as well as to our own familiar cycles of day and night, and the beating of the heart, and sleeping and waking. And this includes the basic idea that all effects flow from causes, and all causes have effects, from which stems the great law of karma, which in the theosophical view, as in Hinduism and as taught in the Buddhist philosophy, this idea of karma is inextricably tied to the cycle of reincarnation. And there is the proposition that we are all souls taking part in a vast evolutionary journey, one that is not only physical, but intellectual and moral. We have the task of forging minds that are wiser and more penetrating, that are better able to understand the mysteries of our existence, and to move from our ego-centeredness toward a greater compassion for others, towards becoming co-workers with great nature. And as self-conscious mind beings, that journey is undertaken through our own self-initiated efforts. No one can do our learning for us. We have agency and responsibility. We are on our way to becoming gods. And this evolution is carried on through a long series of rebirths, each bringing new opportunities for growth, and each life governed by the law of karma, under which we experience the consequences of our past thoughts and actions stemming from both this and prior lives. Well, such are some of the fundamental propositions in a kind of an extremely abbreviated form presented by Madame Blavatsky earlier in her work in The Secret Doctrine. And they are presented not as dogmas to be accepted and believed, but as propositions to be studied and pondered and explored. And they offer a grand conceptual scheme by way of at least tentative assumptions for a logical approach to the idea of rebirth. Now, I wanted to touch briefly on Plato's dialogue of Fedo, as this is one in which Socrates presents several arguments on behalf of the immortality of the soul. The dialogue takes place in the prison where Socrates, having been condemned to death, is soon to take his fatal dose of hemlock, and several of his distraught friends have gathered. And there ensues a lengthy dialogue considering various arguments pertaining to the soul's immortality. And Socrates assures them that he will be just fine, that he has no fear of death. Dying, he says, is after all the philosopher's profession. And how could he, of all people, fear death? I'm not going to try to repeat all his arguments here, but a couple of them seem especially worth considering. I should say that all his arguments presume the existence of a soul. And one is called the argument from the theory of recollection. The fact that we have innate knowledge about certain things, such as the forms, shows that we must have acquired that knowledge in prior existences. There are, for example, no examples of perfect equality in the manifested world, but we are able to grasp the concept of the pure form of equality. Such knowledge must have been acquired in some kind of prior existence. This, of course, reminds us of the Meno dialogue, where Socrates maintains that knowledge is recollection. And I'm going to give here a passage from the Meno dialogue, where Socrates says, "Thus the soul, since it is immortal and has been born many times, and has seen all things, both here and in the other world, has learned everything that is. So we need not be surprised if it can recall the knowledge of virtue or anything else which, as we see, it once possessed. All nature is akin, and the soul has learned everything, so that when a man has recalled a single piece of knowledge, learned it in ordinary language, there is no reason why he should not find out all the rest if he keeps a stout heart and does not grow weary of the search. For seeking and learning are, in fact, nothing but recollection." Another argument Socrates presents is in the Fedo is called the argument of affinity. The soul is invisible. It's of the nature of the forms. It is constant and invariable. On the other hand, the body is composite and subject to dissolution. The soul is what is most real in us. And therefore, it only makes sense that it continues on after the body has passed away and does not dissipate the same way that the body does. Well, towards the end of this dialogue, Socrates has this to say, and that is actually a bust of Plato, who actually wrote this. If the soul is immortal, it demands our care, not only for that part of time which we call life, but for all time. And indeed, it would seem now that it will be extremely dangerous to neglect it. If death were a release from everything, it would be a boon for the wicked, because by dying, they would be released not only from the body, but also from their own wickedness, together with the soul. But as it is, since the soul is clearly immortal, it can have no escape or security from evil except by becoming as good and wise as it possibly can. For it takes nothing with it to the next world except its education and training. And these, we are told, are of supreme importance in helping or harming the newly dead at the beginning of his journey there. And following this, and towards the end of the dialogue, Socrates relates an elaborate mythological description of the world hereafter, which I won't try to summarize since it's just too complex. But it does involve souls being assigned to different destinations based on the nature of their behavior in the life just lived. Those who are really wicked and murderous are cast into Tartarus and never to return. Others are given opportunities for expiation of their sins on earth. And those who lived worthy lives return to new lives on the earth, and those who manage to purify themselves sufficiently through the practice of philosophy reach habitations that are even more beautiful. And then Socrates has this to say: of course, no reasonable man ought to insist that facts are exactly as I have described them, but that neither this nor something very like it is a true account of our souls and their future habitations, since we have clear evidence that the soul is immortal. This, I think, is both a reasonable contention and a belief worth risking, for the risk is a noble one. We should use such accounts to inspire ourselves with confidence. So that seems a good note to end on, even though although most of us would not claim to have any final knowledge of such things. Our understanding is continually growing and evolving and expanding. But some degree of belief or conviction in the immortality of the soul, of the inner man, and its participation in a vast cycle of incarnations seems a belief worth risking, and the risk is a noble one. For it offers the intellectual and moral furniture, the conceptual structure through which, if we have stout hearts and do not give up the search, we can move from a position of thinking of ourselves as a meaningless speck in a vast, cold universe, an accident of nature, a victim of random circumstances, to one of assuming an active role in great nature, of being a participant and a mover in the grand cycle of cosmic evolution, of being a fashioner of our own destiny. And that will conclude my remarks, and I hope we have some good discussion.
I have a couple of things that I was curious about. It kind of revolves around the image that you showed several times of the two hikers on the edge of a cliff, looking at that beautiful vision of the sun and the forest below. And it also ironically revolves around what Truth said before we even started. And that is to say, this play on rest, that with rest, we get to touch the rest of what we have missed. So sometimes people talk about reincarnation in a very stark way. Oh, get rid of desire and think only about the higher self, and life becomes rather empty, which is one of the reasons why I think why I prefer the Upanishadic version that Russ gave us, which is more tender, more loving. Desire is important. And your desire is going to mold your future. And by the way, I'd like to, before I go any further, say thank you so very much. What a beautiful, beautiful presentation in tone and compassion and knowledge. But anyway, this question of desire, and once I was thinking about and trying to write about Plato's divided line. And, you know, the lowest rung is images. And then the next rung up is beliefs. And this is the world of becoming. And the implication was that, you know, you get caught up in images and you're way off base. Once you can begin to reason, as you pointed out, logic and perhaps Aristotelian kind of classification, then you're getting closer. And then if you can touch the Buddhic nature, the noetic nature, okay, now we're really getting somewhere. But I came to the conclusion, and I'd like to know what you think of this, that the end result, say, for example, samadhi, appreciation, love, wisdom, is not the absolute negation of image. Rather, it is the harmonization of all of those principles. It is the transformation of image into symbol. A symbol is an image, full, overflowing with meaning. And so I'd like, if you would please, to speak about this idea that truth initiated, I think, the idea of rest, and you get to touch upon the rest of life, and instead of negating everything. Now, you know, otherwise, why hike up that ridge to look out at that beautiful image of the sun and the forest and the blue skies and companionship?
Thank you, Marlon. Okay, Russ, what do you think?
Well, I'm trying to kind of understand the question a little better, but the idea of there being some, well, let's put it this way. I think that there's a lot of thought in the direction of our evolutionary journey being one of getting rid of the personality or sort of detaching ourselves from all of our earthly attachments and acquiring some state of exalted spirituality. And I think that's a little misleading, because if we look at the statement in the Voice of the Silence, where it's a statement that that cessation of action is not for deva egos. It is it is part of our evolutionary task to be involved and engaged. And so the path that is pointed out in the Voice of the Silence, and that we sort of talk about quite a bit, the path of renunciation, is one where the ultimate goal is one of not of escape and getting away from the world, but having exhausted the possibilities of a cycle of evolution, we remain connected so that we can help on are the rest of life and its evolutionary cycle. So it's a path of compassion. That's what comes to mind as a result of from your question. I don't know, maybe others have more to say about that.
Yeah, just there are other hands up and so forth, but don't you think that theosophy is just about as has kind of a message of engagement more than pretty much any other system one has come across? I mean, it really is. It doesn't seem to encourage the isolation and living in the forest kind of a thing. It seems to be more, and like you said, yeah, go ahead.
Right, and I think what comes to mind is a description I once read of that. What is the difference of a Christian idea of salvation and the Buddhist idea?
Mm-hmm.
And the Christian wants to get away from the turmoil and the strife of this earthly life, whereas in the Buddhist philosophy, the goal is one of transformation rather than escape, and that transformation, as we become more and more identified with the rest of mankind, with the rest of life, then becomes kind of an active participation in the evolutionary process.
Thank you. Can you take a question from Laura?
Sure.
Well, I don't know if I can make it into a question now because it's been answered so well, but nothing in theosophy seems to indicate that the goal is to get out of the cycle of karma and reincarnation. It seems, as you say, that HBB has given us the keys as to how this universe works and who we are,
Mm-hmm.
how we got to where we are, and how we're going to get to where evolution is going to carry us, so that we can act more consciously within the cycle of karma and reincarnation, rather than getting tossed about by it. And as you said, cessation of action is not for Deva egos. And that cartoon that you showed of the man on the cloud saying, "I wished I brought a magazine." And our nature is that we always want to be doing something, but let's do it with greater awareness and consciousness rather than haphazardly as we've been doing.
Exactly. Thanks. Others?
There's David.
David.
Yeah, thanks. I think in one sense, I understand what was said about the idea of the escape, eternal heaven, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, I think maybe we're giving the Christians kind of a bad rap here. I mean, you look at people like Damien, Dorothy Day, the idea of so many groups that have Christian titles attached to them. They're out there helping the poor. So, engagement, I don't know that theosophists have a corner on engagement at all.
Well, of course not. And if we look at what HBB says of Father Damien in the Key to Theosophy, she says he is an exemplary theosophist. So, and he was a Roman Catholic priest, and as far as I know, he didn't question the articles of faith. So yeah, I didn't. Who's to judge? My point is that I think the idea of, I think for many, the idea of just being eternally being in any condition, let alone heaven, for an eternity is just not a particularly acceptable idea. And I don't know what Father Damien or Dorothy Day or those others thought of that, but they were obviously people that were very engaged and very doing a lot of very useful and beneficent and altruistic work. And so I don't know, in a way, you know, what one believes maybe doesn't really matter that much. It's what they do with their lives.
Richard has his hand up.
Richard, speak.
Well,
Richard.
Yes,
yes. I'm sorry about that.
yeah, no problem.
You mentioned the word belief, and I kind of have this. I'm sorry. Am I should? Okay. I have this pet peeve about what we believe creates our personal reality, and I kind of believe that because if we take a hypochondriac, they believe that they have a certain sickness, and that sickness manifests itself. So I'm kind of wondering that if reincarnation has something that is related to our belief, if we believe strongly enough, I guess, is it possible that our belief system has a high influence on whether we incarnate or we achieve that state of bliss after death or not? So I
Okay, I kind of see what you mean, and I think we're told in the philosophy that what we think we are does have an effect on how conscious we are of say the after death states, or whether we have a long devacanic period or a very short one. Someone is say has absolutely no belief in anything but the purely, as I say, it's an abject materialist, doesn't create the mental furniture, the kind of the psychological and intellectual foundation to take with him in the after death states to work with and to build on. Say if he's never had any kind of a spiritual aspiration in his life, there's nothing to work out, and so that would maybe bring him back sooner. So yeah, in that sense, you know, what we really what we really think is real, what we believe about ourselves, that has I think a tremendous effect on how we act, and as well as perhaps on our states after death. And maybe, who knows? I don't certainly, but it seems reasonable. But I don't think whether we believe it or not, I don't think would change the fact of reincarnation. It might just change how much we are able to remember. Because I think you know, having a some kind of a conviction about reincarnation perhaps opens up one's capacity to have a certain kind of memory about it. Maybe not a specific memory of a certain life, but what HPB calls our reminiscences of past lives. Maybe just a feeling of having lived in some place before. Maybe many of us have experienced this, where we see a picture of a village or some kind of scene somewhere that kind of brings us to a feeling that we've somehow been there before, or something like it. And perhaps having a conviction of reincarnation might help those more intuitive types of connections to come through. Sometimes we have dreams that might relate to prior incarnations. And if we have some kind of intellectual or philosophical basis for having a conviction that we have an immortal soul, that maybe can come through a little more. We have a better sense of reality for it.
I want to get to Ray Galvey, because he's been contemplating raising his hand off and on here. So I know he wants to ask a question, but you touched on this in your talk and you just now touched on it, but I think you said something along the lines of this, the logic of rebirth and thinking it through tends to awaken something within us. I mean, did you say that? Am I making that up?
Well, yeah, I know. I think it's one of Mr. Judge's articles. I think it's one of Judge's articles. He says that that when we take up a study of karma and reincarnation, that the inner man rejoices. That there is a recognition, because if what we have been taught about our various human principles and after death states and all, if that's true, that there's that aspect of us which does have knowledge and does remember. We just don't have access to it in our waking life, because we just don't have we just haven't developed the facility for having access to that kind of knowledge. That's something that maybe developed as over a long period of time through self-study and meditation. We become more porous to those higher intuitions.
Now, just Ray, I've seen your hand go up a couple of times. Would you like to raise a question or something, or should we let Monica ask her question right now? Or
what I'm doing is simply tracking this discussion in my own mind, and the diversity of it. It's so, let us say, comprehensive. Certainly not complete, but comprehensive, that I'm just eager to hear what each person is saying before. So when we run out of questions with people, what I'm doing is just checking off my list of questions, which are systematically being spoken to in better ways than I could address them myself. So I'm sort of that rabbit that's been thrown into a briar patch.
Glad to hear your voice.
So, but yes, I do have some questions that haven't been covered yet.
Well, why don't you raise one?
Well, I'd rather listen to Monica and Marlon first.
Okay, Monica.
Well, thank you. I feel like I'm kind of in the category with Ray in the sense that raising and lowering my hand, things have been addressed, but I still have a couple of things. Now, first of all, thank you so much. It's such a wonderful presentation. But you referred to analogy and correspondence, myth, storytelling. These are avenues, ways in which we use the lower mind to access intuition. And so I'm thinking that Buddhi higher manas place is where the memories of previous lives are stored. And I'm thinking in terms of, say, these children who have absolutely no veil over a previous incarnation and they have been able to go to the place they were or where they were buried, or they speak in detail of previous existences. And so I'm wondering two things. Is there an exact state of that child's mind that we in our studies are trying to get to have such an experience or memory? And how, other than these dramatic instances, how does it help us to know the details of previous incarnations?
Well, those are, I think those are a couple of, I think very good questions. Let's take the instances of children, say, who seem to have specific memories of their past lives. And there's been really some wonderful accounts. Of course, there's one, it was written 100 years ago, but Lafcadio O'Hearn had a story, The Rebirth of Casagoro, which was apparently a very well documented account of a little Japanese boy that remembered his prior life and took his parents to the place where he had lived before, and he recognized his mother he had died of like a fever or something when he was a little child, and he remembered his parents, and they remembered the child that they had lost, of course, and it was very well documented. So and there's been a lot of cases like this of children, especially that have remembered apparently fairly specifically their past lives, and how do we explain this? Well, one possible explanation in the Theosophical philosophy is that sometimes if a child dies at a very early age, that same ego can reincarnate very quickly. It doesn't go into the after death states. It kind of finds another avenue, another set of parents that it can connect with, and enters back into incarnation very quickly. That's one possible explanation. But what about cases where people say in like Edgar Casey, who put people in a hypnotic state, and they apparently were able to remember fairly accurately who they were in their past life and so on. And I don't know. These are, there's various ways of perhaps explaining this. I certainly wouldn't claim to have any knowledge about it, but for someone that tends to have a belief in reincarnation, these things kind of tend to confirm that. And for someone that thinks that reincarnation is a bunch of nonsense, these are just anecdotes, and there must be some other way of explaining it, or they're mistaken, or they don't accept the evidence. So, but it is possible, apparently, to remember our past lives in a very detailed way. And if we look at there's one of the yoga aphorisms, I think in the 3rd chapter of the Yoga Aphorisms, explains that if a certain state of control of the mind and a certain state of meditation is reached, one can have direct access to its past lives. And there's stories of the Buddha remembering his past lives. So the question is, what's the usefulness of that?
Yeah.
And that's a good question. I don't know. would we now want to have knowledge of our past lives? Probably not, because who knows what horrors are lurking in our past. We might, we might have done horrible things in our past lives, or maybe we were just, peasants. We just don't know. But having a knowledge of that might not be that useful for us. And,
We're kind of out of time technically, but maybe Ray could articulate his question, I guess, kind of as concise as you can.
Well, first of all, I just would really suggest that you look at, just go into the internet and look up the University of Virginia, their Department of Perceptual Studies. Since the 1960s or early 70s, they've carried on the longest study of reincarnation probably in the world. They've got 1,300 to 1,400 of them 5 years ago that they've been studying for decades. And it's really a wonderful center of contemporary study, and they happen to produce psychiatrists. So there's this profound educational and professional interest in it. And I guess last, the only thing I wanted to that hasn't been covered in this yet is that the idea of analogy and correspondence obviously is key to this. And I think enough has been said about that, except it is good to go in and look up analogy in the dictionary, and you're going to find that there are 5 basic meanings for them. And the wonderful thing is that it covers virtually all that we've been talking about. And so you got to kind of get a kick in the something to get you going with making that more real. And also, I think that what I got out of Russ's most excellent presentation, and I don't think I've ever heard a better summary of the logic of rebirth than what he's given. So I want to thank you very much for that. And that actually the only thing I wanted to say, but I'll just make it in one or two sentences, is the whole range of experience that we have always has 2 sides to it. And it's dominated by the side that appeals to us. So there's nothing that is said about reincarnation and karma that doesn't have a shadow dragging behind it of either disbelief, projection, negativity, reaction. And at the same time, and I think it was the woman spoke before me, before me, mentioned that it is that there are these sides that are popping up all the time, and we need to honor both of them because they all tell us something about ourselves, because none of us know the last word on any of this, including HPB, who said that both karma and reincarnation, but speaking of karma, but it fits with reincarnation, are both the easiest and the most difficult topic.
Easiest.
I would certainly agree with that last statement. The subject of karma is very deep, and it's a study of a lifetime.
Well, gosh, we are out of time. Thank you all for coming and attending, your contributions and your questions. And thank you above all. I echo what Ray just said about being wonderful, comprehensive presentation. So I'm just very, very grateful. And we've all been kind of talking to each other, especially before these presentations, about just how much one can learn with these kind of presentations. And it's so wonderful that we can do that on Zoom. So it's, anyway, so next week, there will be that video presentation from Nandini Iyer on fearlessness on the path to nonviolence. So thank you all very much.